Well, hello, everyone. It is great to be with you today. I am Kristen Hammett and the Director of Ministry Services here at the Signatry, and we are excited about today's webinar, Pivoting in Uncertainty. Our goal here at the Signatry Ministry Services is to equip you in your development efforts and partner with you in major donor conversations. As you develop your donor relationships, you can view us as a key resource for training, community, and partnership as you work with your donors. Wow, what a wild ride it has been. I know many of you are overwhelmed in a variety of areas. A lot has changed since our last webinar on March 26th. I have talked to many of you. I have emailed with others. We've shared over roundtable discussion times. It is certain that we are certainly navigating an uncertain time. Some of you have shifted your efforts during this pandemic to meet some more immediate needs. Others have had to pull back services, and still others have joined forces with other organizations to expand your work in the short term. As it relates to fundraising and development, I know that there are a variety of experiences represented on today's call. Some of you are suffering, you've taken a hit, and then others are hitting it out of the park. I know that you are coming to us with a variety of experiences and a variety of needs, but that's why I'm glad that you are here today. Because though you represent a wide array of experiences, you will all gain something from today's webinar. Regardless of where you find yourself, I am confident you'll find application in today's topic. You know, I was reading a leadership book recently, and it said, in times of crisis, true leadership emerges. And that is so true. When we cannot follow the playbook, but instead have to perhaps build the plane a little bit while mid-flight, that is where true leadership shows itself. So thank you for engaging with us today. I know that you will be encouraged and find some practical tools to help you as you continue to lead your organizations. It doesn't mean everything that you're going to try will work. Not every idea is a good one, but today's tool will help you evaluate some of those ideas, and certainly will be a tool in your toolbox as you continue to forge ahead and lead your organizations, because your mission is worth it. The call that God has put on your work and on the work of your ministry is important. My goal for our time together today is that you will learn to respond versus react, to discern what is a distraction versus an opportunity, and that you can lead your team well. We'll certainly evaluate opportunities to pivot in your development and fundraising efforts as well. Now, I want you to pull out a notebook, a journal, perhaps it is the notes app on your phone. Do something so you can draw some of these images that we're going to go through, as well as these comments and different tools that our presenter will be sharing. I want you to get this information. Now, be assured you will also be receiving this recording after the fact, so you will be able to revisit it and catch what maybe you missed. But I do encourage you to take some notes throughout today's presentation. Now, a couple of logistical pieces before we get started. I know that we all certainly are more Zoom experts than we were perhaps a couple of months ago. We've all been forced, like it or not, to use this technology a lot more frequently than we were previously. But a couple of logistical functions I want to remind you of. The first is the chat box. Dan will be kind of prompting us to talk and share and give feedback over that chat function. So when he prompts you to do that, please share your feedback. It helps us to know what's resonating with you. It also helps us to just engage with you. So anything that we ask you to engage with, please give us feedback via that chat function. And then the Q&A tab, if you look at that toolbar at the bottom where it's a Q&A, if you have a question for us, for Dan or for me, please share that in the Q&A. So you can just type in your question and we will engage with that as appropriate throughout the presentation. So it may be at the time you share it, and it may be that we save it toward the end of today's webinar. But regardless, please share your questions and your thoughts. We want to hear from you. Today certainly is a two-way communication effort, so we certainly want to meet you where you are. All right, got all the housekeeping things out of the way. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Dan Diebel to our webinar today. Dan is the founder and owner of Lost Ball Consulting. Before starting Lost Ball Consulting, he served as lead and teaching pastor at Heartland Community Church in the Kansas City area, leading about 3,500 members and attendees. And then he's taught, he's coached, he's trained organizations through a variety of different exercises, whether that be life skills, work-life balance, different types of leadership. He is a gifted communicator and leader, and we are so privileged to have him. He's also had some experience in the business world as a marketing director for McDonald's. He is a father and a husband, and we are certainly excited to welcome him and his wealth of knowledge and expertise today. So Dan, welcome to our webinar.
Oh, thank you, Kristen. My goodness, that is a gracious introduction. It's awesome to be with you all today. And it's just great to partner with Signatry. What an outstanding organization. And I'm so glad that you all have the opportunity to be served by them. So thanks. You know, as Kristen mentioned, I was in the marketplace years ago, by the way, director of marketing for McDonald's, yes, but not like the conglomerate McDonald's, a little franchisee group out in Santa Barbara, California. I hailed from California and came out to the Kansas City area about 22 years ago, jumped into vocational ministry for almost 20 years. And then just in February, like February the 1st, I transitioned and started a company called Lost Ball. And clearly I have impeccable timing because this is the time to start new things, isn't it? And I named my company Lost Ball Consulting because I'm a big baseball fan, you know, and grew up playing sandlot ball, wiffle ball in the backyard. And I don't know how many of you all did that growing up, but like that was it. You know, oftentimes you just had one ball and you played until either the sun went down or you lost that ball. And when you lost the ball, the game stopped. And, you know, maybe it went up and got stuck on the second story gutter, or maybe you hit it over the wrong fence, that cranky old neighbor's fence, or Cujo, the pit bull, had it in its clutches, whatever. But you knew the game could not continue, you could not play until you found that lost ball. And sometimes it would take creativity. Sometimes it would take courage. Sometimes it would take a lot of teamwork. But we are in a season right now where it feels like the whole world has lost its ball. And everything is on its head. Everything feels upside down. And what we knew in February, all of our plans, all of our systems, all of our protocols, all of our strategies, they seemed maybe clear, or I'll put it this way, they felt a lot more clear back then than they do now. And so we've lost our ball, and the question is, how can we find it? And I just believe deeply, as I know you do, that that the ball is in you with your skills, like Kristen said, with your leadership, with the team that you've assembled, with your donors, with your resources, and most importantly, because of Christ. Christ in you, the hope of glory. That's truly, that's the deepest core of Lost Ball. And how do we help you reconnect, find that ball, put it back into play? So that's a little bit, I'm often asked, what's that about? And are you a golfer? And the answer is I've lost a lot of golf balls too, but that's not what it's about. So today we're going to talk about the pivot tool, and I'll explain that more in detail, but it comes from Mark chapter 1, verse 15, the very first words of Jesus when he arrives on the scene. We'll look at that a little bit more in detail, but it really kind of translates to this question, or it comes from this question. What did Jesus do when he experienced interruptions and disruptions? Why don't you just think about that for a moment? Like, just in your mind's eye, just run through some of the encounters that Jesus had in the Gospels. How many of those were planned? How many of those were in his Outlook calendar, his Google calendar? How many of those were interruptions. And how did Jesus respond to them? Did he pivot towards some and not towards others, etc.? And that's what we're going to look at. We're just going to spend probably, maybe at least the first quarter of our time together, just kind of reminding ourselves about the life of Jesus, the way of Jesus, because that's what we're most after as leaders. We want to lead like Jesus. We want to pivot like Jesus. And I know for me, when February hit, things were going really well. And then when March 14th hit, it was like, okay, this isn't Y2K. This is like 9/11. And everyone's using this word pivot. And I want to be a pivot guy. It seems like the buzzword, but I don't know how to do it. So let's start by looking at how Jesus pivoted. And then we'll apply a tool that can help us kind of live it out from there. So I want to look at one of the very first interruptions Jesus had in the Gospel of Mark. That's where we're going to spend our time today, is Mark. And it reads like this. Then Jesus went down to Capernaum, a town in Galilee, and on the Sabbath, he taught the people. They were amazed at his teaching because his words had authority. In the synagogue, there was a man possessed by a demon, an impure spirit. He cried out at the top of his voice, "Go away! What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." A lot we can talk about here, but we'll keep moving. "Be quiet," Jesus said sternly. "Come out of him." Then the demon threw the man down before them all and came out, so cool, without injuring him. All the people were amazed and said to each other, "What words these are! With authority and power, he gives orders to impure spirits and they come out." And the news about him spread throughout the surrounding area. I think this classifies as an interruption. Would you agree? So Jesus is teaching. He's clearly got his mojo going. People are like, "We've never heard anything like this before. There are people in authority and they teach, but this is like an otherworldly thing." And so Jesus is like moving and grooving. And I don't know how many of you teach. I would assume maybe a good bunch of you teach or preach, or, your public communicators. And nothing worse than your run-of-the-mill garden variety demonic interruption, right? And this is what Jesus experienced, and he pivoted. He pivoted towards this man, and he called out and rebuked the impure spirit. And then in just the most amazing show of power, he exorcises the demon. The demon does everything that it can to hurt the man on his way out, and yet Jesus somehow exorcises the demon out and carefully protects the man on the insides. It's just phenomenal. This is just one of so many examples. I want to just go through in your mind's eye, and using the chat line, and Kristen will kind of moderate this a little bit, but what are other moments that Jesus pivoted? He was interrupted, or there was a disruption, and just in a word or two, just type it really fast. Don't worry about your spelling or your grammar. We'll get it. But where was Jesus interrupted and that he pivoted?
So Dan, we're getting some activity, the wedding feast when they ran out of wine, when they lowered the lame man down through the roof, when the woman touched his garment. So those are our first three kind of responses on the chat line. I think all of them qualify, right?
Oh, they totally qualify. And the one about the wedding is fascinating because Jesus' mom comes to him, interrupts him, and he first kind of doesn't want to do it. And then she does the mom mojo on him. I don't know if it's like the guilt trip thing or what, but somehow she's got the inside track and he acquiesces. So don't know quite where to file that one.
Yeah.
What else? Anything else coming through?
Jesus took the time to speak to the woman at the well. He kneeled down, and when he wrote on the sand or on the dirt, when the religious leaders brought the woman caught in adultery to him. Looks like we've got, and then from his message to the person before him. So several responses. It's great.
So good, you all. So, all right. So we're going to do a little survey through the Gospel of Mark. We're going to basically cover all the interruptions that Jesus pivots towards in the Gospel of Mark. We did pick the shortest of the Gospels, however. So here's what we're going to look at. What was Jesus doing when he's interrupted? And I want you to think about when you're interrupted, are you doing? And because that's where the madness occurs, isn't it? Because you're focused on what you're doing, you want to get it done, you're productive, and then all of a sudden, whether it's a business associate, a ministry partner, or your child, or all of them at once, because we're all Zooming from home, right? So what were you doing? And what was Jesus doing? And who was the person that interrupted them? So Jesus preaching a sermon, man possessed, just looked at it. Jesus was having a quiet time. Sick people interrupt him. Jesus was teaching. Paralyzed man, and you guys mentioned this, with 4 friends, bust through a roof. He's arriving into a new city of Capernaum, probably tired, probably hungry. If you were me, I'd be looking for a quick trip, have to go to the bathroom, but no, a Gentile leader and a sick servant. Then he's arriving into the city of Nain, same thing. But then for his sake, I will say, he wasn't interrupted, but the weeping widow caught Jesus's eye, and he decided to pivot. Jesus is having a very elaborate meal when he's interrupted by a quote unquote sinful woman. Jesus, this is my favorite. He was sleeping. Parents, he was sleeping, and he's awakened by freaked out friends in a boat in a storm. Jesus is getting off that said boat. And then, he's greeted by a man possessed by legions. Are you tired yet? Are you overwhelmed? Does this feel like your life right now? It so often does for me, but we're only halfway done. Jesus just got home to a welcoming crowd. There's a sense of pageantry, jubilation, coronation. I'm kidding. But he's interrupted by Jairus and his dying daughter. Then there is an interruption within the interruption. Can you relate? He's interrupted by a bleeding woman on his way to Jairus' home to heal the dying daughter, a woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. And then Jesus decides to take his disciples away for some R&R. They just come back from a little short-term mission trip. And you can just imagine, they are all hungry for this. But the sick and hungry crowds find them, and they follow him all the way around the sea to the other side. Jesus coming down from a mountain high, also called the Transfiguration. And he's met with a desperate dad and a demonically tortured son. Jesus preaching a sermon. And as a preacher, I got to just say this always, just all these things, they mess with me a lot. By a woman who had a hunchback. Jesus is road tripping with his disciples and interrupted with 10 men who have leprosy. Jesus, this is interesting, was blessing children, and he's interrupted by his disciples who rebuke the parents for bringing the kids. But Jesus says, bring them to me. Jesus coming into Jericho, and he's interrupted by a blind beggar that everyone tries to shut up. And Jesus is praying and speaking in the most intimate terms with his friends when he's interrupted by, cue the ominous music, Judas, the last interruption that led to his arrest, his crucifixion, and his death. So that, y'all, is just in the Gospel of Mark. If we were to apply all the interruptions, it would go on and on, particularly outside the synoptics, the Matthew and Luke, and into John. But it gives you a sense of the life of Jesus, the way of Jesus, and how he pivoted to whom and who did he not pivot to. All right, so now I want you to think for a second. Who did Jesus not pivot towards? He experienced an interruption, but he just kept right on going. So go to your chat line, and I want you to just kind of think about that. What were moments where Jesus just stayed resolute, focused, didn't veer to the left or to the right?
Let's see what our attendees have to say. They're a little slower on this one.
Yeah, this is a little tougher.
Yeah. He was, when he was tempted by the devil, tempted in the wilderness, he stayed resolute.
I hadn't thought of that one.
Oh, look at that. Good job, ministry leaders.
So
got the pastor on his heels a little bit. When Jesus was determined to go to Jerusalem in spite of the danger awaiting, he did not pivot toward the crowds.
Oh, so good.
Yeah. Didn't pivot toward his disciples some of those times when the disciples were telling him to do a certain thing.
Yeah. I'm learning. I hadn't thought of a couple of those. It's good.
Did not pivot when people pressured him to go see Lazarus.
Yeah, which is confusing.
Right?
He loved Jesus, then he loved Lazarus, then he waited 2 more days.
Yeah.
It's another sermon.
There you go.
All right, so here's just a couple of additional things. Religious authorities, sometimes he would pivot, and it would generally lead to the most blistering question or challenge, right? You couldn't box Jesus into a corner. How about Martha? Hey, Jesus, tell Mary to get up and come help me in the kitchen. And Jesus is like, she's got the one thing, not going to take it from her. And I would add, Jesus probably saying, not going to take it from me either. This is what it's kind of all about. How about get behind me, Satan, he says to one of his closest friends. That would be a non-pivot move. How about the 2 brothers embroiled in a inheritance squabble? And Jesus is like, and I know we're veering out of Mark now, okay, for you biblical scholars, but he's like, who made me the arbitrator between the 2 of you? Then he just gives an awesome sermon on greed. And then his very own mom, who was worried, along with his, half brothers, that Jesus had lost his mind. They were coming to take him away. And Jesus was in a packed house, and word got to him, your mother and your brothers are here. And Jesus says, well, who are my mother and my brothers? We have no idea just how shocking that might have been in that moment. Jesus did not pivot towards them. And then, though we looked at it, Jesus in many times did not pivot to his disciples. And like with the kids, they wanted to rebuke the kids from being there, and Jesus like, So we see that Jesus pivots towards some and not towards others. Why? What I hope we sense is this, there is some purpose going on here. He's not just living in this frenetic state. He's not being reactive. He's not allowing external stimuli to dictate what he does. There's something grounding him here. And the question is, what is it? Well, if we just rewind into Luke, we'll see that actually Jesus, and by the way, I have to apologize that all of this has been from Luke. I've been saying Mark, so you'll forgive me for my brain is in 2 different places right now. So if we go just a little earlier in Luke, we're going to see that when Jesus was invited to speak in the synagogue, he walks on up. They give him the scroll of Isaiah. He himself selects the very part of the scroll that he wants to read. It's Isaiah 61, and he reads this. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Interesting, he leaves off the next little part, which is about judgment. And so Jesus is saying, hey, here is why I have come. This is my mission. This is my vision statement. This is the reason that I have become as God in the flesh, to walk among you. It is to fulfill this moment. He literally says, this has been fulfilled in your hearing. And then they try to run him off a cliff because it sounded like absolute blasphemy to them. But if we ask the question, why did Jesus pivot towards some people and not towards others? What was it that anchored Jesus down at his course so he wasn't being reactive, but he was constantly pursuing redemptive moments? It's right here, because he came to proclaim good news. Is that good news physical or is it spiritual? The answer is yes. It's both things. And it's the poor, right? It's the prisoners, those who are captive in one way. Again, that could be spiritual or physical. For the blind, that can be those who can see the deepest truths, or those who literally are not able to see physically. Those who are oppressed. And oppressed is a really interesting word. It means overwhelmed, or it means broken to pieces. And Jesus says, I've come for each of these. If we think in kind of categorical or archetypal forms, what I've done is I took all of the different interruptions and I spread them out over all of the 4 different kind of categories of people. And so you can see here, for the poor, for the sick and the hungry, for the man bound in his own body, those that are possessed, hunchback, for the blind beggar, for the sick people, the sinful, the freaked out friends. I mean, so many under the oppressed. We get to see that actually Jesus is not mindlessly going about his day receiving interruptions and disruptions. He's purposefully seeing those that are opportunities to fulfill his mission. Jesus pivoted towards his priorities. And that leads to a couple of questions. I'm going to invite Kristen to just kind of collaborate with me here, but just a few points. If Jesus is pivoting towards his priorities, this helps us discern between what is a distraction and what is an actual opportunity right now. Do we know what our priorities are? And if we do, how do they align with Jesus and his priorities? That's a hard question. It doesn't mean that we need to switch our ministries to helping the food insecure, for example. You might have a ministry to the wealthiest of the wealthy who are very oppressed. Okay? But how can you connect your priority and your missions to the missions and priority of Jesus? And once we do that, how do we pivot more effectively? Kristen?
Yeah, I think these are all really great questions, Dan. I encourage you all to take notes on these. Just jot these out, or maybe pull out your phone and take a picture of that slide. Really, what occurs to me is when you, Dan, just before the slide where you have categorized the different people, the distractions, so to speak, just before that in the verse, it's almost like an organization's mission statement. So that is what he came to do. He was proclaiming the good news to these 4 groups of people, right? Or to these 4 types of people. And I think that's a parallel to our ministries that are joining in on the call right now. Go back to your mission statement, what it is that you do. Why are you here? It's for this. And that could be one thing. It could be 4 things. It could be fairly ambiguous, right? But then you go to these options, or these what could be distractions in this time. And that's where I'm going to evaluate, constantly bring it back against that mission statement. Does this fit? So that's organizational. And I think that that's applicable department by department. It's applicable in your fundraising efforts. Where am I getting distracted? Perhaps it's in social media. And actually I'm not finding that that's gaining traction with any kind of funding. So I need to pull back and really focus on the places where I'm able to ensure I'm getting my work funded. So I just think that's a really great illustration out of scripture that can be so applicable to the work that we do day in and day out. So thanks, Dan, for that.
Yeah, spot on. And we'll talk more about that. You'll learn here at the end that we're going to offer kind of a roundtable part 2 exercise where we'll drill down, and we'll really begin to learn, okay, how do we apply the pivot, but how do we apply it against our priorities or our mission? So we'll talk more about that. This also really applies to our personal lives. I'm always so challenged when I'm focused. If you're an Enneagram type person, I'm a 3. Kristen, you're a 3, right? Yeah, so we hate interruptions, even by those we most love. You know, my 3 daughters, they come in with a question and I'm like focused because nothing is sweeter to me than checking something off the list, right? And I'm always challenged by seeing how Jesus demonstrated his love for those in moments like this. So let's think for a moment, and this might be the most the biggest duh in the world for you. But what's a disruption in your world? It could be helpful to think about COVID-19. Could be helpful to think about the racial anguish and strife and turmoil. Or it might be more helpful to think of something more specific. Kristen, what would you add there?
Yeah, I would say, regardless of what the external disruption has been, I would look at what internal disruption it may have caused. So I'd really challenge you over the course of the next 20 or 30 minutes as Dan continues to delve into this actual tool to evaluate one disruption within your organization. Maybe it's in your department, maybe it's in your role, maybe it's in your fundraising effort. Certainly I'm going to kind of continue to kind of tap on that piece, the fundraising and the development work. But there are certainly lots of disruptions to the way we do life now. But what internal disruption has that caused?
No, that's really good. Yeah, because we can get, this is a paralyzing question if we're not careful, right? Because we've all lost our ball. We just have no idea where to find it. And so I think, I love that, to think internally, where do you feel the disruption most internally? And just focus on that one thing, not everything, just one. That's really good. So what we're going to apply now is just say, how do we, as simply put, how do we walk as Jesus walked? How do we live as Jesus lived? How do we lead as Jesus led? And this is just a little simple tool you can draw on a napkin. It comes from a guy named Mike Breen, who first introduced it to me. And it goes by a different name, by the way. But as I was just hearing the word pivot and using the word pivot and thinking about pivot, but not knowing how to pivot, I thought about this tool. And I thought, I actually think this is what it is, what we're talking about. And it does come from when Jesus says, first words out of his mouth in Mark. That's where my confusion came, by the way. The time has come. That word for time is kairos. This is the time stand still. And where did the time go? Because it's an epochal sense of time. The kingdom of God, which is the rule, the reign, and the realm, and where God holds sway over all things, is breaking and bursting into our time, matter, and space. And we have two things that we're called to do. Repent, which really means, change your way of thinking, or turn, and believe, which is a verb. It's not a cognitive assent. It is a sense of trust. So repent and believe the good news. And this is what we do in our life as disciples. This is what we do in our lives as leaders of organizations and ministries. Here's the tool. So you're going about your typical day, your life, your chronos sense of time, your chronological sense of time. If you can see my cursor here, just kind of doing the thing, right? Working the plan, and then bam, disruption, interruption, right? Could be a small thing, could be a big thing, could be a very subtle thing, could be just something in your spirit that you're going, I don't know, I'm sensing something here. The question is, how do we now discern? Is this a distraction? Do I need to pay attention to this? Do we need to adapt? What do we do here in this moment? And here's the pivot move, okay? The pivot move, if you see my cursor, we're going to actually go from this moment, some sort of interruption, could be macro, micro, whatever, but we're going to go down underneath, and it's going to feel really counterintuitive because it will feel backwards. If you are a productive junkie like me and like Kristen, it's going to feel really unproductive because now you're going really down. You want to be up here, right? We always want to do this. We're going to go down here backwards, and then we're going to come up, gain all the inertia and the torque right here, and then bam, we're going to come up and experience growth. And that growth can be in your ministry. It could be interpersonally. The growth can be spiritually with the Lord, whatever, okay? So there are two main moves to the pivot tool. One is we're going to stop. That's the repent side. I'm going to stop. And two, we're going to start. That's the I'm going to believe side. I'm going to trust side. I'm going to step into something new here. Okay. And there are six kind of stages along the way. All right. Number one is we're going to observe. There's something that has happened, and I'm going to leverage my observational skills and talk about it. Number two, we're going to reflect. From what I observe, what does this mean? Then we're going to discuss it. And we're going to go into more detail on each one of these, by the way. Then we're going to make a plan around it. Then we're going to align others towards it. And then we're going to act. This is the pivot tool. All right, 6 steps. Let's do a drill down. Observe. If you'll notice here, there's a little dictionary here, always kind of helps. Observe means to notice or perceive something and register it as being significant. Doesn't mean that you have it figured out. Doesn't mean that you have it dialed in. You just go, there's something about that. And if you're into like spreadsheets or, research, it's a little bit like data collection. I'm like, this is important. I'm going to collect it, but I haven't moved it to meaning yet. I'm just going to I'm going to sit with this. It's mastered by things. Here's how we develop observational skills. It's mastered by a spirit of curiosity, by having just an element of awareness, of practicing it with intentionality. Like literally, I have times, or I'll phrase it as a question, do I have time where I am bringing intentional space just to observe what's going on around me? And do I have a method to observe? And that's what I really appreciate about this tool. I now have a method to do this. It's a stop along the way that I actually know, oh, I got to do that. And I'm not great at doing that. So yesterday, my youngest daughter just got her hair cut. She got like 5 or 6 inches cut. And I come blowing in from here and there, and I can already see the shock on your face, Kristen. But I get all the way upstairs, and my wife says, did you notice anything different about Hadley?
Oh.
I even knew she was going to go get her hair cut. And I still didn't notice because I was blowing and going. This is missed by hubris. You think you know. Technology, your head is down at the screen. Do you know that there's a new bone being developed in the human back of the skull because our heads are down staring at our screens? Input overload. We have tons every nanosecond we're bombarded with, and we're living at a frenetic pace. I love the quote from Bilbo Baggins, J.R.R. Tolkien's wonderful work, The Fellowship of the Ring. I think we can all relate to this. Why do we struggle applying observational skills? Well, because we feel all thin, sort of stretched, like butter that has been scraped over too much bread. And so we have a challenge to even practice the first stop along the way, just to observe. It's really not hard. It just means that we have to be present. The second is to reflect. Now we're taking what we observe.
Can I challenge our listeners on that observe piece just for a second? I told you guys I'd kind of hit on this development piece. You know, that's where the Signatry can really add value. But I am challenging those that are listening and tuned in today to, in this pause, in this observe step, to really evaluate. We know there's been a disruption. I know from talking to many of you that has affected you in different ways. So I would challenge you to evaluate your giving. Observe what your giving to date has looked like. Who is giving? Where's the bulk of the giving coming from? Who has potentially stopped giving? How does it compare year over year in categories? I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as a former development director, of looking at the overall number and feeling okay about that because we're tracking okay overall. But I think this is an observation or a time that you can really leverage this observation tool with where is giving off. That will help focus as we move into these next steps. You know, how do I need to move forward based on this data collection step, which, to be frank, is sometimes hard to do. It's hard to slow down and to pause and to really observe because, Dan, to your point, frenetic pace, get it done, check the box, keep moving. And this is really what will inform those choices going forward.
So good. And as a pastor of many years in the donation world, I would say also I can look back at many times where I've sat down with donors or been on a call with a donor, and the money was still there in terms of their giving, but they were somewhere else in their hearts. And so I allowed the money to be the lead indicator, but I look back and go, there was more to observe there in the conversation that I missed. And oftentimes what I missed was a pastoral opportunity of care, or there was the conflict that was down deep. So I love that, Kristen, both externally on the dollars, but also interactively with the people that we're meeting with as well.
Yeah, excellent point. Thanks, Dan.
So we move from observation to reflection, and this is where we think deeply or carefully about things, just as we step back as a culture. And I'll ask it rhetorically. Do we do this well? We do not do this well. We let others bombastically think for us, but we have lost the art of reflection. If observation is data collection, this is now saying, what does the data mean? And it's mastered by making space, intense focus around something. Indirect activity, which is the opposite. That means you go mow your lawn, or you shoot baskets, or in my case, you play wiffle ball, or you go for a walk. Something indirect, or you have a good night's sleep. It also can be determined by the unique pathways that you most reflect well with. Could be, again, out in nature. Could be in solitude and silence. It could be you're a verbal processor, and you just need someone else to kind of think this out loud with, okay? That's reflection. And we have really lost the ability to do this by assuming that we know, by what we want it to mean. So when we take observational skills, we can just go, oh, it means this. I haven't really thought about it, but preferentially, I want it to mean this. We don't reflect because we're so distracted, and we're panic swiping and watching a lot of Tiger King right now. And so we're being bombarded in our culture that is telling us what to think, and it's polarizing us, and it's dividing us, it's paralyzing us, and it's doing like what it's doing in Bruce Friedman. He's a pathologist, a scholar, University of Michigan Medical School, no small thing, right? And he says, I can't read War and Peace anymore. And not only can he not read, the Russian classics, for example, he said, I can't even read a blog post if it's more than 3 or 4 paragraphs long. This is our intelligentsia. This is our academia bringing confession. What does this mean for us who maybe are less stout academically? What does this mean for pop culture? It means that we've lost the ability to truly reflect. So where do you do that? How can you do that? How do you make space for it? Kristen?
That's great. That's a challenge for me, but I think from a donor perspective, honestly, Dan, part of what you said earlier in your previous point is relevant in this reflect point too, as far as the donor space is concerned. So sometimes it's not just what the numbers are telling me, but what lies below. Do I assume that donor is going to continue to give because they've done it? Am I really diving into that relationship and asking some questions that really the crisis gives me permission to ask that perhaps I didn't have before, or allows me more boldness and courage to ask some things I didn't ask before? Because to be frank, things are on the table now that weren't before, relative to just the landscape of all of our kind of collaborative or community experience that we're having. So I would encourage folks that are listening to still be diving into that data, but then looking beyond the numbers a little bit. Again, not those gross numbers, but look at those individual giving records. What's going on with those individual families, and reaching out to them and connecting them with them, perhaps in a way that you haven't done before, to kind of prevent yourself from making assumptions or preferences and continuing with the status quo. So I think that's a really, really good point.
Yeah, so good. And that moves us to the third stop along the way, discuss. This is where you bring a group of people and you ask the question, who can help me see this better? I think we're going to talk about this on 2 levels. One is, as a team, your leadership team, or your partner in ministry, whatever it might be. It could be your spouse, where you're going to bring them in and say, I've seen some things here, and I've been thinking about it, and it's bringing me to some conclusions. Can I bounce those off you? Can I invite you into this? And it's a little bit like if you go to a museum and you see this beautiful oil painting, and you say, hey, come over here, and you stand side by side and you look at it together, and one person with their own experience, their own insights maybe on art, but also their own vantage point. We're going to look at the same thing together, but we're going to see different hues, different impressions, different textures, and we're going to bring that together. None of us can see fully together. The Apostle Paul says we all see in a mirror dimly this side of heaven. We need one another to kind of fill in the color for us. And so that's what the discussion point is. It's not necessarily going, hey, what do you guys think? It doesn't mean you're abdicating as leaders what's required of you to make a decision, but it does mean you're going to invite others in. And it's mastered by the courage to ask I know for me, a lot of times I want to like go away. I'm actually more introverted. So I want to like go down, figure it all out, then come up and go, ta-da, you know, and that actually never works on 1,000 levels. That never works. And it's never as good than when I invite others in and I practice deep listening. And in order to do that, I'm fostering a sense of relational trust. You have to have trust. Why? Because we actually really need open debate. We want people to interrogate what we're thinking to always make it better. And that this stop along the way is missed by a bunch of knowers who are just change resistant, who are going to see all the problems with it, but also by yesers. The overly optimistic ones are the ones that just want to tell you what you think they think you want to hear. The shoulders, who are just going to should all over you about what you should do, and they have no sense of like ownership in it. And then just committees. I just want to say committee think, group think, all those kinds of things, the bureaucracy in the way. What you need are some discussion ninjas to join you. And what needs to happen in you and in me in this moment is, I love from Herb Keller, founder of Southwest Airlines, he says, listen for more than you hear. So listen for what's behind the words, for the deepest meaning.
So good. Hey, Dan, I will tell you honestly, the first time we went through this material, this discuss piece, I was thinking purely in the realm of internally, this is where you get your major gift officer and your development director, perhaps your board, your entire development department together, or whatever department you're leading. And I think it's so clear to me is how important it is to get an outside perspective. So we are only getting a one-dimensional view if we're only looking internal. And I think that is really an opportunity for those of you who are listening or might be listening after this to engage your donors in some of these conversations. Now, certainly there need to be some safe parameters, and there need to be some carefully chosen conversation topics. But this is where you really can invite them to be a part, and it helps. It's great insight. So this whole concept and really comment from Herb Keller with Southwest Airlines, listen for more than you hear. This is a challenge for me as a 3, because I'm not a great listener. I'm a really great doer, but there is so much power in listening for what's said and for what's perhaps not said, but you can kind of pick up on. So I think that's really, really huge.
Well, yeah. And as ministry leaders, we need someone that's invested in us, and I'll say it crassly, and could give a rip about the ministry that we lead. And so what we need is both a strong partnership and team around the table with us leading out the ministry together. And that's beautiful. And they need to be as close in as possible. The problem is they are most invested in these things, and thereby oftentimes experiencing the largest blind spots as well. So I love that, Kristen, because bringing in those outside eyes where they actually care just about you. Yeah. And they do care about your ministry, of course, because they want to give you wise counsel, but they don't have as much stake in the game for it to be scary for them or fraught with, some of the things we'll talk about here in a moment. I also wanted to just say, as we talk about donor development, because Kristen, I wasn't thinking about this when we first went over this either, but now putting on my donor cap, having that hard discussion, you've observed some things in the numbers, you're reflecting on what this possibly means. And I know after so many years of donor development, there would be something there, and I would be a little bit gun shy to ask the question, how are you doing? Mm-hmm. And what I was always afraid of was coming across as, hey, we really need your money right now. Mm-hmm. And what I would miss is that actually this is another kingdom opportunity to come alongside someone and care for them. And part of caring for them is bringing things to the surface. It could be a concern about your ministry, could be a concern about leadership. More often than not, it's things going on in their real world. And from a long-term perspective and view, for them to receive care for you in this moment, holy cow, pick up the phone. Holy cow, put on your mask and go have a coffee, whatever is appropriate. But it's just so important to have that discussion.
Absolutely. All right, Dan, I'm going to stop interrupting so much because we got 10 minutes and I know you've got great content we still need to get through. So
Halfway through. Here we go. We'll
Sounds
pick it
good.
up. So if you look over here, so we observe, we reflect, we discuss, and then you take all the best from that. And now you're at this like centrifugal point or whatever you call that, where now you have this energy and this motion, and you're going to plan because you've made a decision. What am I going to do about this? You're moving from the stop side to now the start side. And that's going to be mastered by, in you and your team, a sober grasp of risk and reality. You've confronted the brutal facts. It's going to be mastered by a compelling why. This isn't just what are you changing? What are you pivoting towards? This is why are you doing it? It's going to mean you're going to have to stop some things in order to fully give yourself a deep yes to a new thing. And a plan, as Kristen was saying earlier, a plan or a mission by which to gauge or benchmark, is this really who we are? It might be a great idea. Do we have the right resource for it? Do we have the right talent for it? Are we positioned to do this well? And is it aligned with our mission? It's missed by, if you go around here and you're planning and you're trying to please everyone, if you're trying to accommodate everyone's input, it's missed by incremental thinking. Well, let's just kind of like do a little bit here versus take that big monumental step. It's missed by unchecked optimism. It's going to work. Or just unbridled fear. It's going to be horrible. It's missed by swinging both sides of those pendulum. But here's what I love. If that plan place is about decision, this comes from Soren Kierkegaard, Provocations. And I got to say, the quote is so much better in its full length, but it goes like this. A decision raises us with a shock from the slumber of monotony. It breaks the magic spell of custom. It breaks the long row of weary thoughts. Decision is the awakening of the eternal. There is something super powerful about that planned stop along the way, because it means motion and it means let's do this thing. And how do we do it together? Kristen, do you want to add anything there?
I think we're good. I just think I would encourage folks to embrace that concept of there's power in stopping. That stop list
Right.
can sometimes be very difficult, but very empowering to really propel you the rest of the way around that circle.
Great. And then how do we go around together? And that's what a line is, bringing someone in the line with something else. And it's asking as a leader, do others see what I see? You've been swimming in these waters for a while now. You've been doing the observation and the reflection, and you forget that the water was really cold when you first jumped in, and now it's super warm. You have acclimated to it, right? But now you're moving out, you're excited, you're like months ahead of everyone else. And so you have to stop and go, do others see what I see? And that's mastered in a culture. If you think about your team, if you think about your staff, mastered by a culture of what I made up this word, a culture of nimbiality. It's like nimble and flexible and a bunch of other things all together, but it means highly adaptive and able to roll with a new pivot. You've reversed engineered the outcome, meaning you're going for the furthest out person. What do they need to know about this in order to be aligned with this new pivot that we're making? You need to decide what's the feedback loop here. Am I saying this is what we're doing? Are we saying that together? Is there voice? Is there vote? Every organization is different there, but it's going to take trust. It's going to take a lot of trust organizationally with your donors, within your staff, in order to do this. It's missed by just telling people what you're doing, but not connecting it to the why. Really important. It's missed by, at this point, you think you've done the work as a leader, so you hand it off to others and you move on to the next thing. This is going to take you walking this out, embodying it as the first one to go here. It's missed by, within your organization, tribalism and cynicism. Oh, just another thing. This is just another thing. All right, I'm going to let this one pass. I'll see if I pick up the next pivot, right? And that leads to false agreements too, where everyone nods their head at that alignment point, and then they go off and say, well, I was never on board. It's a lousy idea, whatever. And so that alignment is huge in order to bring this to full fruition. You want to add anything there, Kristen, or just keep going?
Keep on going. I think it's good.
All right. Well, let me give you my favorite quote about this. This comes from Alan Kreider, the patient ferment of the early church. How did the early church go from 120 people to 25 million in a couple of centuries? And it was this patient ferment. It was brewing. It involved, look at this, ordinary ingredients that at times synergize, that's what we're talking about with alignment, synergized into a heady brew. And at this point, y'all, we act. And I have no points for that, because we have done the work. It's time to go. Dare to act on the good that lies buried within your heart, says Kierkegaard. And it doesn't mean that you don't have brokenness in your heart, but it does mean that you've worked out a lot of it through the course of doing this tool. And now it's simply time to go. So I want to ask you, some of us, when we do this, we go the wrong way around the tool. You see this? If you're looking at my arrow, we go to the left. We go, oh, disruption, interruption. All right, let's act. And then let's try to make everyone aligned, right? And that leads to all sorts of challenges. We become a culture that just starts stuff. It's frenzied, unfocused. It forces integration. It's another start without a stop. It's a temporary tweak, but you're not getting to systemic change. Leads to a busy culture, burned out staff, confused donors, and a high activity, but a low yield. Why? Because you haven't gone down to the root system to say what's really at the depth of this. Others of us, and this is oftentimes how I would preach, I would observe, I would reflect, I would discuss maybe with others, and then I would go preach. And I'd go, ta-da, about this, but I wouldn't implement it fully into my own life. And so some of us go the right way around the pivot tool, but we just think about stuff. And that means paralysis by analysis. We confuse talking and think we've done it. Unresponsive, we don't actually pivot or adapt. It's often driven by a fear of failure. You can often tell that's going on when someone needs more and more data. So it's low activity and low yield. So on the chat line quickly, what would you say if you went one way or another, kind of had a default? Let's just assume for a moment that only Jesus goes perfectly around the 6 stages of the pivot tool, right? And that one of us goes one way and the other way, and we all kind of get it wrong. What would your default wrong be?
It's a great question. You know, just even Dan, I'll be waiting for folks to join in on the chat real quickly. But I think that I'm even identifying it in my own experiences at a variety of different work environments, how we can have both. And then sometimes it's good to have, if we admit that none of us is perfect in this, it's good to at least have a balance. So if we can have a healthy exchange, we can challenge ourselves and our organization to be better by embracing the whole picture. Got one chat comment halfway in the right direction.
Good. Yep.
So that would be similar to what you shared. May even get so far as a plan, but then lose patience and charge ahead. The most difficult thing is to align. So get consensus and get everybody engaged. Those are great feedback, folks. Thanks so much for your participation in that chat box.
Yeah, we'll keep thinking about it. And what I suspect is as you go about your day and your leading, you'll go, oh, I just did it. You'll begin to see it. At least that's what happens for me. Here's what I just want to review the build for it. I'm going to encourage you just, you know, I rarely now sit around and like will draw out the pivot tool because it's become more intuitive for me. But like if this is the first exposure you've had to it, you can take a screenshot of this or whatever. I want to encourage you to go teach this to another ministry partner or a friend or a spouse, just so you can kind of talk it through with them and really kind of anchor it down deep within you. And what I want you to think about just over the course of the next 24 hours or so is where must you pivot right now in your ministry life and in your personal life? What would you add, Kristen?
You know, I think that's exactly, it's funny because I was thinking about, you know, the next steps, and one of my suggestions would be that exactly what you just said relative to telling someone about this, whether that is your children or your spouse or your roommate or your workout partner. Start the conversation in the next 24 hours because that's when I think we begin to work it out in our brains, right? And however we end up applying it, I think you just start working through it and it can become more of a mindset. So I think that's a great recommendation.
Great. And I'm going to go back really quickly. I went too fast. If you want to take a screenshot, there you go. We're up against the hour. 1, 2, 3, take, right? And I'd like to pray, and then I know we just have a couple of next steps. Is that right, Kristen?
Absolutely. Sounds great.
Yeah, so Lord, over these ministry leaders, we just know that as you said 2,000 years ago, the time has come. We know that it has come, it is coming, and it will come. The kingdom of God is breaking in. And so we are not to despair. We're not to cower and fear. We are to put our hands to the plow, Lord, and say, what mission and what soil and fields have you called us to? They are white and they are ripe. And can we see it? So, oh God, open our eyes in such tumultuous times and help us to see in every interruption where there's opportunity for your kingdom to break in my own life and heart, in these ministry partners and leaders and those that they serve, oh God. And we pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Wow, great tool. I know it'll apply to folks that were listening, those that will tune in later, both personally, professionally, organizationally, in our donor work. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Totally.
Great tool. So next up, what's next? For those of you listening who are going to be or tuning in over the next couple of days, you have an opportunity to engage further with Dan and the Signatry next week on Wednesday, June 24th at the same time. We're going to take a deeper dive into this material. So Dan, if you'll advance to the next slide, I believe we have that. There you go. So you can take another one of those screenshots. We'll also capture this in the follow-up email. But you can register for this roundtable experience where you can pick one area and apply it. So we will walk through this slide, we'll walk through this tool, and we're going to break into smaller groups to be able to really navigate this and make it applicable. Then our next opportunity, we have a roundtable opportunity to make the ask over Zoom. So we know technology is here to stay. We know also we prefer face-to-face interaction, but we are going to have another roundtable opportunity. Actually, it has been changed. So it's not Thursday, June 25th. It's actually going to be pushed to July 9th, and you'll get that information in email also. But please register for that roundtable as we will learn how to engage donors better with technology. And then finally, just connect with us, both with the Signatry and with Dan. I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. Join our Ministry Services Facebook group. There are great tools there, posted 3 or 4 times a week. I really think they would help you in your development work. And then connect with Dan. You can see his email there and his website, Lost Ball Consulting, and engage with him. There are opportunities to join in additional cohort groups of 6 to 8 leaders that join together on a monthly basis. Again, we just scraped the surface of one of the tools and one of the offerings that Dan has relative to enriching both personal and professional lives, organizational health, and then our communication and leadership. So please engage with us, continue this conversation. Like we said, both Dan and I mentioned connecting with someone, telling them, teaching them this tool, sharing what you've learned. That's when you really begin to internalize it and make it a part of your practice. So continue the conversation, continue to connect with us. The Signatry wants you to thrive as a ministry, and we want to see revolutionary generosity impact your ministry and further your mission. So thank you, Dan. Thanks for joining with us today. Thank you, ministry leaders. We are for you, and we hope to see you next week at our roundtable. Goodbye.